Morning. Today's lecture is The Mormon Experience and Controversy in Illinois, Part 1. First, some background. Between 1839 and 1846, the Mormon experience in Illinois is probably one of the most important events in the state's antebellum history, or at least in terms of the West Central Illinois' antebellum history. Here, a social crisis developed over conflicts between Mormons and significant elements of the non-Mormon or Gentile population. The culmination of this conflict was the Mormon exodus from Illinois to the Great Basin, lying west of the Rocky Mountains in present-day Utah. The Mormon leadership essentially gave up on trying to establish Zion in the settled areas of the U.S. and chose the far west as their only hope to create their version of the kingdom of God on earth. In 1839, Western Illinois was still a frontier to some degree, though that period was rapidly coming to a close. Most of the counties of today were established by 1839, although there are still several more to be created. The population was growing during the 1830s and 40s, and the two counties that are most important to us for this lecture are Hancock County, which in 1840 had a population of 10,000, and Adams County, which had a population in 1840 of 26,000. And both those counties are along the Mississippi River to the far west of the state of Illinois. And as I had said in the previous lecture, the state had been settled from the south north by Southerners coming out from the southeast. And many of them were escaping to the wilderness as a way to maintain a way of life that was coming to an end in the southeast as plantation culture was heading west. These settlers did not necessarily oppose slavery, but they were hostile to abolitionists. These settlers did not appreciate activist government, nor did they strongly support publicly funded education. The domination of the state by Southerners, however, was beginning to wane as Yankee immigrants settled in the state in the 1830s and 40s. Most of these newcomers left the mid-Atlantic and northeastern states to establish farms and businesses on the frontier and recreate the civilization they had left behind. They settled in the northern and central parts of the state, bringing a strong commercial business culture, a commitment to public education, church building, and newspaper publishing. European immigrants began to settle in the state in large numbers in the antebellum period too. The Mormon converts from the British Isles made their appearance soon after the founding of Nauvoo. However, German, Irish, and Scandinavians settled in cities and in the rural areas throughout this period as well. The Mississippi River was the major trading and transportation route for the Hancock, Adams, and other western Illinois counties along the Mississippi, as well as those on the Missouri on the other side of the river in Missouri and Iowa. The economy of the region and the state as a whole, as you might expect, focused heavily on farming. To facilitate economic development, the state embarked on internal improvements, or what we would call infrastructure today. The first major internal improvement project that the Illinois General Assembly took on was the Illinois and Michigan Canal. This canal would link Lake Michigan with the Illinois River, which flows into the Mississippi. Illinois would then have a transportation route running through the heart of the state. Soon after that project was under consideration, other advocates for internal improvements argued for a railroad project in the state. They believed the canals were already becoming obsolete. The General Assembly decided to back both projects in 1833. Later in the decade, work began on the canal and what would be called the Illinois Central Railroad. Unfortunately, in 1837, a nationwide financial panic hit, causing several years of depression. Illinois ran into great public debt financing these projects. Only later in the 1840s would Governor Thomas Ford get the public debt under control. The canal wasn't completely functional until the end of the 1840s. The railroad project was a bust, and another one wasn't tried again until around 1850. The subsequent railroad boom in that decade in the state then made the canal obsolete or near obsolete. In the 1830s and 40s, the Democrats and the Whigs vied for control of Illinois government. The Democrats tended to be the stronger of the two parties, but there were pockets of strong Whig support, especially among the Yankee and business segments of the population. The one branch of government that the Whigs controlled was the state Supreme Court. They did gain a governorship in the mid-1830s, but during the Mormon period, both governors and the General Assembly were controlled by Democrats. However, the Whigs and Democrats were fairly evenly matched in voter strength. Hancock County was primarily a Whig county, while Adams County was primarily a Democratic county. Voting laws were extremely liberal. A white male 21 years of age and older only had to reside in the state for 6 months in terms of being eligible to vote. And that went for U.S. citizens as well as non-citizens. If the newly arrived Mormons in Illinois voted as a bloc, they could sway an election, especially in elections for local representation. The Western frontier during the antebellum period was not necessarily more violent than other frontier periods. Nevertheless, there was rough and tumble fighting, which was very popular on the frontier, particularly in the South. This kind of fighting had few rules and only ended when one party admitted defeat. So eye gouging, biting off noses and fingers were common occurrences. Because no modern police force existed, the local sheriff and the local militia were the only institutions to suppress violence and other criminal behavior. But horse thievery, armed robbery, and counterfeiting were some of the most common crimes that one would find in southern and western counties in Illinois. Frequently, individuals took the law into their own hands to establish justice. They acted as vigilantes, but were commonly referred to as regulators. And regulators on the American frontier goes back to the colonial period. The antebellum period is also marked by urban violence, especially ethnically and religiously inspired riots. For example, in 1844, Philadelphia experienced a bloody riot between nativists and Irish over the issue of the Bible, which was the one to be used in the public school. It was going to be the King James Version or the Catholic sanctioned Bible. Anti-abolitionist rioting was common in the North too. Illinois was not exempt. Eliza Lovejoy was murdered and his anti-slavery newspaper destroyed in Alton, Illinois. Across the river in Missouri, Governor Lil, Lilburn um, Boggs issued the infamous extermination order to drive the Mormons out of the state. This led to the Hans Mill massacre of Mormons in October 1838. Illinois had almost 40 newspapers in 1839, with several circulating in the central and west counties. Many of these newspapers were affiliated with political parties and were more propaganda oriented than professional journalism. In fact, journalism as we know it today really didn't exist in the 1830s and 1840s. Editors usually drove a particular agenda or served the interests of the local community as boosters and also as an ally to local businesses and to political constituencies. For example, Quincy, which was the largest and most important commercial town in Adams County, had two newspapers: the Quincy Argus, which leaned Democratic, and the Quincy Whig, which obviously supported Whig policies. Warsaw, like Quincy, was a river town, only smaller, and was probably one of the most important cities in Hancock County before the building of Nauvoo. It had the Warsaw Signal, whose editor Thomas Sharp seemed to take great pleasure in ridiculing and criticizing the Mormons and Joseph Smith in Nauvoo. Part of his hostility stemmed from town rivalry, as Nauvoo grew into being one of the largest cities in Illinois. The Nauvoo itself had newspapers too: the Times and Seasons and the Wasp, which would later be named the Nauvoo Neighbor. Both were newspapers out of Nauvoo. The Times was more doctrinal and church business related. The Wasp and the Nauvoo Neighbor were more newsy regarding local, state, national, and international news.